When my mother walked in and caught me with my father-in-law, the look on her face told me there was no turning back. What happens when a secret so forbidden is exposed in the most shocking way possible? Will love or betrayal decide the fate of my family? Before we unravel this scandalous story, don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales like this one. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The door creaked open behind us, a sound so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. But when I turned, my heart stopped. There she was, my mother, standing frozen in the doorway, her expression a volatile mix of disbelief and anger. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Time itself seemed to pause as the weight of her discovery bore down on me. I hadn't planned for this. I never imagined it would come to this. The heat of shame flooded my cheeks, and I pulled the sheet tighter around my trembling body. My father-in-law, stood motionless beside me, his face pale, his hand still outstretched as if trying to reach for an explanation that wouldn't come. It was a tableau of betrayal, and there was no hiding it. "What is this? What am I looking at?" she finally demanded, her voice a sharp whip that echoed off the walls. The tone cut through me, each syllable heavier than the last. My mouth opened, but my voice betrayed me, stuck somewhere between the lump in my throat and the pounding of my heart. "It's not what it looks like," I stammered, though even I didn't believe the words. It was everything it looked like, and worse. The raw truth of the moment hung between us, suffocating and inescapable. She stepped into the room, her gaze darting between us, trying to make sense of the scene before her. "Not what it looks like?" she repeated, the bitterness in her tone sharp enough to draw blood. "Explain it to me then. Tell me why you're sitting there like this, with him." Her words felt like blows, each one exposing the layers of guilt I'd been trying to bury. I turned to him for help, for some kind of solidarity, but he looked away, his shame mirroring my own. We were partners in this act of betrayal, but in that moment I felt more alone than ever. "I didn't mean for you to find out this way," I whispered, the words weak and meaningless. They sounded pathetic even to my ears. My mother's gaze narrowed, her disbelief turning to something darker, disgust. "You didn't mean for me to find out," she repeated, incredulous. "You didn't mean for me to find out? That's what you're worried about?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and I saw the tears welling in her eyes. "Do you even realize what you've done? Do you?" I couldn't answer. There were no words to defend myself, no excuses that could possibly explain how I'd allowed my life to spiral to this point. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unforgiving. She shook her head, as though trying to rid herself of the image burned into her mind. "Your husband, your family, what were you thinking?" Her voice broke then, and I could see the hurt that I'd inflicted upon her, as if my actions had shattered not just my life, but hers too. The day this all began seemed so ordinary. I was preparing dinner in the kitchen, the aroma of roasted chicken and herbs filling the air, when he walked in. My father-in-law, Robert, had moved in with us temporarily after his wife passed away. It was supposed to be a short arrangement, a few months at most, while he got back on his feet emotionally and financially. My husband, Evan, had insisted we help, and I agreed, wanting to do the right thing. After all, Robert had always been kind, even in his stoic way, and family helped family. That's how I rationalized it. Robert had aged well. For a man in his late 50s, he carried himself with a quiet confidence. His salt and pepper hair was always neatly combed, his shirts pressed, and his deep-set eyes held a sadness that I couldn't ignore. When he moved in, he was still reeling from his loss, his grief wrapping around him like a heavy coat he couldn't shed. I felt sorry for him. I felt responsible for making him feel at home. Evan worked long hours at the firm, often leaving before dawn and returning well after dinner. It wasn't something new, but lately it felt heavier. We had been growing apart, our conversations dwindling to logistics about bills, chores, and weekend plans. The warmth that once defined our relationship had faded into routine. I missed him, missed us. Robert's arrival had been a welcome distraction, something to fill the silence in the house. At first, our interactions were simple, polite. Robert thanked me for the meals, helped clean up afterward, and occasionally joined me for coffee in the mornings. We talked about trivial things, the weather, the news, the adjustments he was making without his wife. He was reserved, often deflecting the conversation back to me. I shared small things, work updates, a funny story about the neighbors, but I kept the deeper parts of myself hidden, as I always did with in-laws. It was easier that way. But over time, something shifted. It started with his attentiveness. He noticed things, small things, that Evan had long since stopped seeing. The new curtains I had hung in the living room, the way I always added a pinch of cinnamon to my coffee, the books I read in the evening. "You're reading Austen again," he'd say with a soft smile, his voice warm in a way that made me feel seen. It wasn't flirtatious, not at first. It was kind. Then came the moments I couldn't explain. The way his hand would linger just a fraction longer when he handed me a mug. The way his eyes would catch mine across the table during dinner, an unspoken understanding passing between us. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Surely, I told myself, this was just two lonely people finding comfort in shared company. But deep down, I knew it was more. And I knew it was dangerous. Evan, oblivious as ever, didn't notice. He trusted his father implicitly and saw no harm in leaving us alone together while he worked late nights. "Dad's lucky to have you around," he'd say, kissing my cheek before rushing out the door. His words, meant as reassurance, only deepened my guilt. One night, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Robert offered to help. It wasn't unusual, but the atmosphere felt different that evening, charged in a way I couldn't quite place. We stood side by side at the sink, the only sounds the clinking of plates and the running water. When I turned to grab a towel, I bumped into him, his hand instinctively reaching out to steady me. "Careful," he murmured, his voice low. His hand rested on my arm for a moment too long, his touch burning through the fabric of my sleeve. I froze, caught between the urge to step away and the inexplicable pull I felt toward him. "I'm fine," I said quickly, stepping back and forcing a smile. But the look in his eyes lingered with me long after I went to bed that night. From that moment, everything changed. The boundaries that had once been clear became blurred. Our conversations grew more personal, more intimate. He shared stories about his late wife, about their struggles and joys, and I listened, hanging on every word. In turn, I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't with Evan in years. I told him about my fears, my frustrations, my dreams that felt increasingly out of reach. He listened with an intensity that made me feel valued, cherished. I knew it was wrong. I told myself every day that it had to stop, that I needed to pull back before it went too far, but I didn't. I couldn't. There was something intoxicating about the way he made me feel, alive, desirable, understood. It was a stark contrast to the cold, distant marriage I had grown accustomed to. The night it finally crossed the line, we had been sitting on the porch, sharing a bottle of wine. Evan was working late, as usual, and the summer air was thick with the scent of jasmine. We talked for hours, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine. At some point, the topic turned to regrets, and his voice grew heavy. "I regret not telling her how much I appreciated her," he said, his gaze distant. "I always thought there would be more time." I reached out instinctively, placing my hand over his. "She knew," I said softly. "She had to have known." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. "I hope so," he murmured. His hand turned, his fingers intertwining with mine. I should have pulled away. I should have said something to break the moment. But I didn't. I let it happen. When he leaned in, it wasn't sudden. It was slow, hesitant, giving me every opportunity to stop him. I didn't. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, then more certain. The kiss was soft, almost innocent, but it held a weight that threatened to crush me. When we pulled away, the reality of what we had done hit me like a freight train. "We can't do this," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, but his hand didn't let go of mine. We sat in silence, the unspoken truth hanging between us. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The days following that kiss were a blur of guilt, confusion, and a deepening sense of entanglement. I avoided Robert at first, telling myself that distance was the only way to regain control. I busied myself with chores, errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the house wasn't big enough to avoid him entirely. We collided in subtle ways. A fleeting glance in the hallway, the brush of his hand as we reached for the same dish in the kitchen. Each interaction felt loaded, a reminder of the boundary we'd crossed and the precarious balance we were trying to maintain. What made it harder was that Robert didn't seem to share my resolve to pull away. If anything, he seemed emboldened, his presence more deliberate. He sought me out in quiet moments, his eyes carrying an unspoken question I wasn't ready to answer. I told myself I had the strength to resist, but his words, his gaze, even the faint scent of his cologne chipped away at my defenses. One evening, while Evan was away on another business trip, Robert and I found ourselves alone in the living room. I had tried to retreat to the bedroom, but Robert called after me. "Wait, please, can we talk?" His voice was soft, almost pleading. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, knowing that staying would only complicate things, but I couldn't say no. Not to him. I turned slowly and walked back into the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch, as far from him as possible. He sat across from me, leaning forward, his hands clasped together. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "I can't stop thinking about that night," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "About you." "Robert," I began, my voice trembling. "We can't. Whatever this is, it's wrong." "I know," he said, his gaze piercing. "But that doesn't change how I feel, or how I think you feel." I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth hung between us, undeniable. I felt it every time he looked at me, every time he was near. I felt it even when he wasn't. It wasn't just attraction, it was connection, a deep, aching need that I hadn't felt in years. "We have to stop," I said, more to convince myself than him. "This will destroy everything. Evan, he trusts us." Robert flinched at his son's name, the weight of his guilt evident. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't told myself 1,000 times that this is wrong, but knowing doesn't make it go away?" I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. "We need to end this, now." He didn't respond immediately. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "If that's what you want, I'll respect it, but I don't think it's that simple, not for either of us." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I stood and walked upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself I had made the right decision, that I was putting an end to this before it could spiral further out of control. But the knot in my stomach told a different story. The following week, I threw myself into my marriage, desperate to rebuild what had been lost. I planned a romantic dinner for Evan, complete with candles and his favorite meal. He seemed genuinely surprised and touched by the gesture, and for the first time in months we talked. really talked. About work, about life, about us. But even as we laughed and shared memories, I couldn't shake the image of Robert's face, the sadness in his eyes when I told him it had to stop. It didn't stop. A few days later, Evan had left early for work, and I was alone in the house with Robert. I tried to avoid him, staying in the bedroom under the guise of cleaning. But when I came downstairs to make lunch, he was there, sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. "Morning?" he said softly, his voice tentative. I nodded, keeping my distance. "Morning." For a moment we existed in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then, without warning, he stood and walked toward me. I backed up instinctively, my heart racing. "Robert, don't—" "I'm sorry," he interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I shouldn't, but I can't help it. I can't pretend this isn't happening." He was close now, too close. I could feel the heat of his body, see the vulnerability in his eyes. "Please," he whispered. "Tell me you don't feel the same, and I'll stop. I'll leave. But if you do—" I closed my eyes, my mind screaming at me to step away, to end this once and for all, but my body betrayed me, drawn to him in a way I couldn't control. Before I could stop myself, I felt his hand on my cheek, his touch sending a shiver down my spine. His lips brushed mine, tentative, questioning, and I didn't pull away. This time, there was no hesitation. The kiss deepened, our emotions pouring out in a flood of longing and guilt. It was desperate, almost frantic, as if we both knew the moment would shatter the second we let reality seep back in. When we finally broke apart, breathless, I took a step back, the weight of what we had done crashing down on me. "We can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his expression filled with regret. "But we already have." The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. We tried to resist, tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Evan's sake. But the pull was too strong, the bond we had forged too powerful to ignore. Each secret meeting, each lingering touch, only deepened the web of lies we were weaving. Then came the moment we had both dreaded. The night my mother showed up unexpectedly, her knock on the door shattering the fragile world we had built. Robert and I froze, our guilt written plainly on our faces. She didn't say anything at first, her eyes darting between us as realization dawned. "What is this?" she asked finally, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "What's going on here?" The words stuck in my throat, my mind scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't come. Robert stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "It's not what it looks like," he began, but my mother cut him off. "Don't insult me," she snapped. Her gaze turned to me, her disappointment palpable. "How could you? To Evan? To your family?" Her words were like daggers, each one piercing deeper than the last. I tried to speak, to explain, but there was nothing I could say to justify what we had done. The silence that followed my mother's outburst was suffocating. She stood there, waiting for an explanation, her eyes drilling into me with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. Robert stepped forward, as if to protect me, but I raised a hand to stop him. This was my mess, and I had to face it. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My knees felt weak, and I sank into a chair, unable to look at her. "It wasn't supposed to happen." "Wasn't supposed to happen," she repeated, her voice rising. "You're married to Evan, my son-in-law, and this is his father." She turned to Robert, her expression hardening. "How could you let this happen? She's your daughter-in-law." I didn't plan for this, Robert said, his tone soft but steady. It just happened. We didn't mean for it to go this far. Didn't mean for it? Her voice cracked with the weight of her anger. You didn't mean for it to go this far. Yet here you are, sneaking around behind your son's back. Do you even hear yourselves? Her words cut through me, each one a sharp reminder of the betrayal I had committed. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that it wasn't what it looked like, but the truth was undeniable. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. You have to tell Evan, she said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. He deserves to know. No! The word burst from my lips before I could stop it. I looked up at her, panic rising in my chest. Please, Mom, you can't tell him. It would destroy him. And what do you think will happen when he finds out on his own? Because he will find out, she said, her tone icy. Secrets like this never stay hidden. Do you think he'll forgive you when he learns you've been lying to him too? I felt the weight of her words settle over me, suffocating and inescapable. She was right. Evan would find out eventually, and when he did, the fallout would be catastrophic. But the thought of confessing, of seeing the hurt and betrayal in his eyes, was too much to bear. Robert spoke then, his voice quiet but resolute. I'll tell him. My head snapped toward him. No, you can't. I have to, he said, cutting me off. He's my son. He deserves the truth, no matter how much it hurts. I won't let you carry this burden alone. My mother stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to me, her gaze softening ever so slightly. If he tells Evan, it needs to be soon. The longer you wait, the worse it'll be. I nodded numbly, the reality of what lay ahead sinking in. This was it, the moment I had been dreading since the affair began. There was no turning back now. Robert waited until the weekend, when Evan would be home for more than a few hours. I spent those days in a state of constant anxiety, jumping at every sound, barely able to eat or sleep. My mother stayed away, likely too angry and disappointed to face me. I couldn't blame her. When Saturday morning arrived, I felt like I was walking to my execution. Evan was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone, blissfully unaware of the storm about to hit. Robert stood near the doorway, his expression grim. Evan, Robert began, his voice steady but quiet. We need to talk. Evan looked up, his brow furrowing. What's up? You look like someone died. The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. My heart pounded as I sat down across from him, my hands trembling in my lap. Robert glanced at me, then back at his son. There's no easy way to say this, so I'm just going to say it. He took a deep breath, his shoulders tense. Something happened between me and her. He gestured toward me, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. Evan stared at him, confusion flickering across his face. What are you talking about? Robert hesitated, his resolve faltering under his son's scrutiny. I'm talking about an affair, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. With her. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, Evan didn't react, as if he hadn't processed what he'd just heard. Then, slowly, the realization dawned, and his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to rage. What? He said, his voice low and dangerous. He turned to me, his eyes narrowing. Is this some kind of sick joke? I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. Evan, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. You didn't mean for it to happen? He repeated, his voice rising. How do you accidentally sleep with someone, let alone my father? I can't explain it, I said, my voice trembling. It just happened. I was lonely, and we connected in a way I never expected. I know it's wrong, but nothing, he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. The sound echoed through the room, making me flinch. You betrayed me, both of you. Do you have any idea what you've done? Robert stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Evan, please. I know this is unforgivable, but— Unforgivable? Evan interrupted, his voice dripping with venom. You think? You're my father. You were supposed to protect this family, not destroy it. I made a mistake, Robert said, his voice cracking. A terrible mistake, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I love you, Evan. I never wanted to hurt you. Evan laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and devoid of humor. You love me? Is that supposed to make this better? I reached out, my hand trembling. Evan, please. Don't, he snapped, pulling away. Don't you dare touch me. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. I wanted to say something, anything, to make him understand, but there was nothing I could say. The damage was done. Evan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need to get out of here, he said, his voice shaking. I can't even look at either of you right now. He grabbed his keys and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. I sat there, staring at the empty space where he had been, my heart breaking into a million pieces. Robert sank into a chair, his head in his hands. I'm sorry, he whispered, though I wasn't sure if he was speaking to me or to the ghost of his son's love. The days that followed were a blur of silence and tears. Evan didn't come home, and I didn't know where he had gone. My mother refused to speak to me, and Robert retreated into himself, a shadow of the man he had been. When Evan finally returned, it was only to pack a bag. He didn't speak to me, didn't even look at me. I stood in the doorway, watching as he gathered his things, my heart shattering with every item he stuffed into his suitcase. Evan, please, I said, my voice breaking. Don't leave, like this, let me explain. There's nothing to explain, he said coldly. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. And just like that, he was gone. As the door closed behind him, I sank to the floor, the weight of my choices crashing down around me. I had destroyed everything, my marriage, my family, my life. And for what? A fleeting connection, a moment of passion that had cost me everything. And yet, even in my regret, I couldn't deny the truth. I had loved Robert in a way that defied reason, but love wasn't enough to undo the damage we had caused.